As we move forward here, we're going to consider the influences and also the ongoing debate regarding the term NeoVedanta. In terms of influences, we're going to consider first the process of Vedanticization, as well as the notions of diversity and pluralism present in NeoVedanta and the influence on Europe and North America. NeoVedanta has become a broad current in South Asian culture, extending far beyond the Dashanami Sampradaya and the Advaita Vedanta Sampradaya founded by Adi Shankara. The influence of Neo-Vedanta on South Asian culture has been called Vedanticization by the scholar of Hinduism Richard King. An example of Vedanticization is Rama Maharshi, who is regarded as one of the greatest Hindu saints of modern times, of whom Sharma has noted that, quote, among all of the major figures of modern Hinduism, he is the one person who is widely regarded as a Jivanmukti. Although Sharma admits that Ramana was not acquainted with Advaita Vedanta before his personal experience of liberation, and Ramana was never received an initiation into the Dashanami Sampradaya or any other Sampradaya, Sharma nevertheless sees Ramana's answers to the questions by his devotees as being within the Advaita Vedanta framework. So this is, again, an example of Vedanticization. In response to the developments in British India, and here we're including Sri Lanka, Myanmar also a little bit, and East and West Pakistan, that would be Bangladesh and Pakistan today, as well as the Republic of India. In response to the developments in these lands during the colonial era and European, especially British critiques of Hinduism, and also some critiques from American Protestant missionaries, various visions on South Asian diversity and unity developed within the nationalistic frameworks and reform movements. So the Brahmo Samaj strived towards a notion of monotheism while no longer regarding the Vedas as the sole religious authority, and the Brahmo Samaj had a strong influence on the Neo-Vedanta traditions and trajectories of Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Radhakrishnan, and Gandhi, who themselves strived towards not a monotheistic notion of Hinduism, but a modernized humanistic concept of Hinduism with an eye for societal problems and needs. Other groups like the Arya Samaj strive towards revival of Vedic authority, so being a sort of revival of this Vedas. In this context, various responses towards India's diversity developed. So this would shape the understanding of diversity and pluralism moving forward. In modern periods, that is the 20th century, especially the latter half of the 20th century, there's been an orthodox measure of the primacy in the Vedas, almost rising to a degree of an interpretation that resembles orthodoxy, in part in response to this imposition of the expectation of an orthodoxy from colonialist scholars and also critics of Hinduism. This imposition of the primacy of the Vedas has been joined with a grand narrative of Vedic origins of Hinduism and even humanity itself. The exclusion of Jainism and Buddhism excludes a substantial part of South Asia's cultural and religious history from the assertion of a strong, positive Hindu nationalist identity. This became gradually over time the Hindutva ideology, which solves the problem, quote unquote, solves the problem by taking recourse with the notion of Hindutva or Hindu-ness, which includes Jainism and Buddhism as part of Hinduism, and also argues that Sikhism is actually part of Hinduism as well. In fact, really fierce adherents to Hindutva ideology will argue that actually Sikhs are just Hindus themselves, right? It's not a distinct religion, right? So a recent strategy exemplified by Rajiv Malhotra is the use of the term Dharma as a common denominator, which includes Jainism and Buddhism. Now, stepping out from this, according to the scholar of Hindu studies, Larson, Malhotra's notion of the so-called Dharma traditions and their integral unity is another example of neo-Hindu discourse. Malhotra is being different in using the term Dharmic tradition and Dharmic systems, in other words, but referring to all the Hindu, Buddhist, Jaina, and Sikh traditions within that, and then playing upon the notion that this universal Dharma is actually centered in Hinduism, and those are just variants of Hinduism, right? So this would be different than saying Dharmic religions from a scholarly perspective, where a scholar would give equal weight to those religions. So here we're seeing that there's a proposition by Malhotra that those traditions, despite their differences, share common features, the most important being a Hindu-centric notion of Dharma. This integral unity, therefore, ultimately creates a whole that only exists within Hinduism itself, a sort of synthetic unity which starts with parts that exist separately from one another, but then returns to Hinduism in its true essence. Now, Malhotra explains that some of his critics confused integral unity with homogeneity, and that he's actually accepting pluralism. But it is important to note that his strong emphasis on a Hindu-centric definition of Dharma weights all of this integral unity, despite differences, towards a very Hindu nationalist understanding of inclusivism or inclusivity. The problem, of course, being with Hindutva, and here we're talking about like right-wing extremist nationalist interpretations of inclusivity as such, is that there is actually an exclusion of communities, especially notably Muslim communities in South Asia. The contestation, and sometimes violent contestation, between Muslim and Hindu communities in South Asia is sometimes described as communalism. And notably, Hindutva ideologues have been criticized for stoking communalism and communalist violence. Now, according to the Hindu studies scholar Reinhardt, NeoVedanta is a sort of theological scheme for subsuming religious difference under the aegis of Vedantic truth. And according to Reinhardt, the consequence of this line of reasoning is actually communalism. The exclusion of Muslim communities is implied by the notion of inclusivity being limited to Dharmic religions. So the problem that is set up is that all people belonging to one religion have common economic, social, and political interests, and these interests are contrary to the interests of those belonging to another religion, which is of course not inherently true. Now, communalism has become a growing force in contemporary Indian politics, presenting several threats to the Republic of India's stability. Most notably, of course, a top figure, current head of state, Narendra Modi, when he was a chief in a sort of provincial chief in province before he ascended to head of state, there were massive series of these various communalist violence, especially targeting Muslim communities in the province that he was head of, right? So he's been criticized for stoking this as well. And here we have these sort of threats to the secular notion of India as a plural, secular, democratic, socialist society, right? So let's remember that India's constitution is that it's a pluralistic, secular, democratic, socialist society, meaning that it's a democracy with a multi-party state which has interests in socializing the wealth of the country for the sake of economic equality, economic democracy as well. Now, Reinhardt notes that Hindu religiosity has played an important role in the contemporary nationalist movement, but we also have to remember that the contemporary nationalist movement is actually a minority position within the country itself, just by pure representation of the entire population, despite the fact that the BJP, for example, claims to be not just the majority party, but the dominant force in the country. So this can be a little bit mucky, to say the least. But scholars have basically postulated that the Neo-Hindu discourse is the unintended consequence of initial moves by thinkers like Ram Mohan Roy and Vivekananda, as well as British colonialism. So it's important to remind ourselves that this is not just Raja Ram Mohan Roy's ideas gone astray, but also that there is this colonialist and post-colonialist fervent nationalist response in the mix as well, which becomes ethno-nationalism, especially in the early 20th century, in the far right wing of Indian politics. But Reinhardt also points out that there is a notion from contemporary scholars that it's clear that there isn't a neat line of causation from all of this milieu towards the contemporary issues facing the contemporary Indian state. So, nonetheless, for your post, go ahead and see if you could find a news article from, I don't know, a British source most likely would be easy, or the scroll.in, and then look up communalism, and then see if you could just make some quick comments about what's at stake here for the future.